The United States and Soviet Union fought together during the Second World War to defeat Hitler Germany. After they defeated Hitler Germany, Germany was divided into two parts. There was East Germany and West Germany. East Germany was controlled by the Russians, and West Germany was controlled by the United States. Of course, this is the beginning of what we call the Cold War. There was a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Cold War was really about a sphere of influence. The United States wanted to go around the world and democratize the world and preaching for democracy. The Soviet Union wanted to get allies in the sphere of the United States to sort of have control of these countries. But unlike the United States, the Soviet Union did not really sponsor coup d'etat in a lot of the countries, which the United States did in favor of its own foreign policy ambitions. So, of course, there were two organizations, and this is very important. The first organization was NATO, which was created in 1949, just after the Second World War. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But us in this organization, basically the members of the United States, Western countries like France, Great Britain, were all part of NATO initially. They're the one that started NATO. But there was another organization called the Warsaw Pact, WARSAW, the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was sort of another organization by the Soviet Union, which included some of the Baltic states. They were all part of the organization. And it was such as a response to NATO, to sort of two big organizations, two spheres of influence, where the United States has NATO and the Soviet Union, of course, had the Warsaw Pact. Now, over the years, there's been a whole big tussle between the two great powers, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And it was all for influence. Who's going to influence this government and that government? Which country is going to want their foreign policy to be the main staple for a particular country? That is basically what the fight was about. So the big fight, the Cold War, sort of came to an end in 1989 when Germany, you remember the wall that separated East Germany from West Germany came down in 1989 under Ronald Reagan president, of course, the Bush father as vice president at the time. So at the time when the Berlin Wall came down, there was a deal that was made between NATO and the Soviet Union at the time, actually the former Soviet Union. Let's talk about Russia at the time. And the deal was very simple, that the NATO was not to expand. In other words, NATO was not going to ask former Soviet Union's territories like the Baltic states, some of the former countries which made part of the Soviet Union, to join NATO. That was the agreement. And the reason why is because Russia did not want NATO to station weapons in countries that share borders with Russia. I mean, that's just too close for comfort. They didn't want that. And it sort of makes sense because if you recall what happened in Cuba under Khrushchev, when Kennedy was president and the Soviet Union wanted to station certain ballistic missiles in Cuba, and there was almost the beginning of World War III, because the United States was not going to allow the Russians to station that type of weapons in Cuba. So sort of the same thing here, where the Russians are saying, we don't want NATO to be close to our border because we don't want them to put weapons in countries that bothers us. Makes sense. Now, from 1989 to about 1996, the agreement basically hold. The agreement hold, there was no problem. However, under Bill Clinton, the State Department, some people inside the State Department started to think that the United States should declare hegemony on the world. Like they should be the only chief. No one should be able to check them. And what they've decided to do is to breach the agreement that the Russian had with NATO to sort of move NATO, expanding NATO eastward. That is, start asking some of the Baltic states, some of the former Baltic states, to become part of NATO. And then from 1996 on to 2004, they had gotten a lot of countries to become part of NATO. But the Russians obviously have always made it clear to them that to the extent that certain countries, for example, like Ukraine or Georgia, countries that share borders with Russia, where the Russian considered those territories, those areas as sort of strategic places, they were not going to allow these countries to become part of NATO because obviously they are too close to the border. They are too strategically important for security. So the Russians made it very clear that they consider this as a security threat to ask this country to become part of NATO because of all what's entailed in NATO in terms of becoming a member. So the Clinton administration pushed this. In fact, this was against the advice of a lot of different military officers, military guys who said, look, you are looking for a war eventually with Russia. We don't want to get involved in Third World War. Pushing NATO eastward is always going to upset Russia. But you have the neocons in the State Department who just, for whatever reason, feel like the world belongs to them and they could do whatever they want in the world. So yes, they've decided, we're going to push this forward. We're going to do whatever the hell we want to do. And they continue to do that. In 2008, Vladimir Putin asked NATO for it to become a member. In fact, there's an agreement that was signed between Russia and NATO, which called for working together with the Russian for peace and weapon control, arms control and all that. So they said to Russia, actually the US said to Russia, no, we don't want Russia to become part of NATO. And one of the reasons why the United States decided that Russia was not to be part of NATO was because the armed defense industry in the United States wanted to have what we call an enemy. And now to bring Russia into NATO, which would mean essentially that they have lost that enemy. Because in order to sell weapons, you have to have an enemy. You have to have someone that the boogeyman that you think is going to kill everybody, and that we have to arm ourselves to the teeth. We have to have all sort of nuclear weapon because there's somebody coming to get us. That is what happened. So Russia couldn't get into NATO. Okay. But Putin has already made it clear that there is a red line not to cross. And the two red line not to cross was Georgia, the state of Georgia, which was a former Baltic state that belongs to the Soviet Union at one time in the past, and of course, Ukraine. Now, the Georgia certainly wanted to become part of NATO, and there was a big war. The Russian practically destroyed the country. And then NATO kind of slowed down a little bit because they understand that Russia was very serious. But Ukraine was a different story because Ukraine is sort of what I would call the bridge between sort of this side of the world with Russia and the rest of Europe. Now, Ukraine, obviously, the United States and the rest of Europe always wanted Ukraine to be part of the European Union. They wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO. And there were reasons for that. Some of it, most of it, is money, it's economics, it's really buying weapons from the weapon industry, and so on and so forth. But Russia already made it very clear they consider Ukraine entry into NATO as a serious security threat. In fact, they call it an existential threat that would threaten the very existence of Russia. What this means to them is that they will fight to death, which will include the use of nuclear weapon if Ukraine were to become a member of NATO, which kind of makes sense. It's sort of reliving 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. We're reliving that now in 2022, 2023 in Ukraine. Now, the United States, all the people in the State Department, the CIA, the NSA, they all knew the story. They're not stupid people. Those are guys who graduated from the best universities. They're not that dumb. They really knew what the stake was. But because there was so much money to be made by selling weapons, they didn't care. They keep pushing Ukraine to become part of NATO. Now, certainly, there are people in Ukraine that are very smart. Viktor Yanukovych was a very smart guy. He understands what was going on. He says, look, my country is going to be neutral, but the CIA didn't like him. So what did they do? They got rid of him in 2014. And of course, he fled to Russia. Now, the Russians are looking at this and they're asking themselves whether these people are crazy. And they have sent memos to the State Department. They have tried to send messages to say, hey, guys, we are running sort of a head collusion here. We're not going to allow this to happen. If you think Ukraine is going to be part of NATO, you have something else coming. But hey, the people in Europe, the French, the British, everybody else was like, forget about you, Russia. We're gonna move forward. But of course, what is NATO? NATO is really the United States. The United States call all the shots. All the other countries, they just like play second feeders to the U.S. The U.S. do whatever the U.S. want with NATO. So they decided that they were going to push for Zelensky to become president. Of course, Zelensky became president. The first thing he did was talking about joining NATO. And there were meetings between Zelensky and Putin. And one of the reasons why Putin wanted to meet with Zelensky, Putin was trying to tell Zelensky, listen, we're cousins. In fact, we might even be brothers. But what you're trying to do is to jeopardize the security of Mother Russia. And we weren't going to allow this to happen. Now, you would think that Zelensky would understand that, because if the shoes was on the other foot, Zelensky would have done the same thing. But the United States, the CIA, because remember that the directors of the CIA would fly to Kiev to brief Zelensky when he first became president, to give him briefing about what's going on in Russia and what they think the Russians are going to do. But what they were saying, apparently, they were lying to Zelensky. They weren't telling Zelensky that the Russian army was going to pound on them. They were telling Zelensky that, oh, don't worry about it. We're going to defend you. We're going to push you into NATO. And if Russia just but lift a finger to come after you, we will show them who's boss. But of course, the CIA knew they were lying. They knew they were lying. The United States does not want to get into a war with Russia. It's mutual destruction. There is no way to win a war with Russia. You're not just going to win because they got more nuclear weapons than the U.S. They've got the strategic place around the world. They would blow up the world. Everybody would die. Everybody knows it. So what they've always done in the past is do what we call proxy war, where the U.S. is supporting one side and the Soviet is supporting another side. And then the people in the middle are dying, but the big guys are not dying. They're just sitting there sending weapons, okay? So that's what they decide to do in Ukraine. Now, when this war started, everyone who's been following international relations, who knows anything about this thing like I do, was saying that there is no way Ukraine can win this war against Russia, that Ukraine would eventually lose and probably lose half of their territories. That's what I said 3 years ago, and that is exactly what's about to happen now, because the Donbass is gone, Crimea is gone, the Donetsk has got part of all eastern part of Ukraine are now under the control of the Russian army. So, but this fight did not have to happen. The millions of people who died in the Russian-Ukraine war didn't have to happen. These people didn't have to die. None of them had to die. All the NATO people had to do is stay the hell away from the Russian border. It was made clear to them. There wasn't like, oh, we weren't sure what the Russian was saying. The Russian has been very clear. Now, of course, the United States actually never entered the war officially. They've been buying weapons from the defense industry, from weapon makers in the United States, making them rich and send these weapons to Ukraine. But Ukraine only have 1/10 the size of Russia. And there's been a lot of disinformation in the U.S. Western media talking about the capability of the Russian army. And we know they're lying. We know they're lying, but most people, most Americans obviously do not know that. They don't know that if most of the things that they hear in Fox News or in CNN and some of the American media have been sanitized for consummation by them because the U.S. government doesn't want them to know truly what we are dealing with. But people like me and others who understand the situation, who knows what's going on, try to educate people about where we were heading. So now Donald Trump becomes president. And Donald Trump, say what you want about him, he understands the capability of the Russian army. He understands what's going on. And why should he make an enemy out of Putin if he can make a friend out of Putin? Because why should we try to get involved in war, killing people, destroying the world, when two very powerful countries can put their heads together to solve problems like, for example, the climate issue and whatever other issues we have in the world, we can all work together to solve it. But why should we fight each other? Because there are people in the United States who believe that they have a right to exist in their own term, and then the other people around the world should also exist under their term. Like, they don't understand that the United States is but less than 5% of the world population. That right now, the United States really contribute very small to the world economy. We're looking at the BRICS and some of the other countries. I mean, their GDP is a lot more than the United States, Japan, and all the other countries combined. So the world is changing. And the faster we understand that in the United States, the better it is for us. In Ukraine, millions of people have died. Both Russian and Ukrainian have died senselessly. Millions of them. And the war has been going on for 3 years now. And these people, perish for absolutely no reason. The only reason was the defense industry wanted to make more money. They wanted to sell more weapons. And that's what they did. But now, with Donald Trump in the White House, I am hoping that before the end of this year, we can put sort of an end to the war in Ukraine and try to rebuild Kiev and some of the other part of the country that have been destroyed. But Ukraine would never, ever be a member of NATO. That would never happen. It would never happen. And I think that the the Russians have said it before, and they're going to say it again. They're not going to allow Ukraine to enter NATO. It's a matter of existence. It's a matter of security. For the Russian country, they're not going to allow it. And I think we in the West should understand and acknowledge Russia's need for security and their concern, just like if the Russian or the Chinese decided tomorrow that they wanted to go to Mexico or they wanted to go to, Canada and put, a military base in Mexico and Tijuana, or put a military base between New York and Canada and the border there, threaten the very existence of the United States, I am sure that most American, if not all American, will be up in arms. And then we will be right to be upset. Why the hell would we want, a Russian base and the border between the United States and Canada? We wouldn't want that. So think about what the Russians are thinking. Think about how they feel about that. And I think part of the problem we have in the U.S., we seem to think that the only feeling, the only reality that matters are just our realities, our feeling, and nobody else in the world matters. In fact, the entire world should live just the way we live. And I have to tell you that we are not the best, proctor of good life. So the way we're living, most people in the world don't live like that. And believe me, they don't want to live like that. So we have learned a great lesson here. And the lesson is that we have to pay attention. And those of you who may or may not know the history of NATO, the World War, the Cold War, I think this sort of what I'm doing here, try to explain the entire story to all of you so that when people are talking, you understand the history of what happened and the reason why we are where we are now and who are behind all this senseless war that are just, people are selling war just to make money. Thank you.